Welcome to Lily's Heart Tales, where even a good night's rest can be lethal. Alpha Rhett is a formidable leader, defined by his immense strength and unwavering focus. His mate, Ava, is the light of his pack. They believed nothing could break them until an ancient fey curse found the only weakness stronger than their alpha bond: sleep. It happened without warning. Rhett was concluding a rigorous training session, his power surging and focused, when he heard a quiet thud from the pack house. He found Ava slumped against their bed, having succumbed to a sudden, overpowering exhaustion. Rhett rushed to her side, his alpha instincts screaming, but as he reached out to touch her, a wave of debilitating, magical fatigue slammed into him. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was a heavy, paralyzing weight pressing down on his mind and body. His vision tunneled, his muscles locked up, and he nearly collapsed onto the floor. He struggled, crawling back a few feet, staring at his sleeping mate in utter confusion and terror. He felt weak, vulnerable, and utterly defeated, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a pup. He tried to stand, but the fatigue was crippling, reducing the powerful alpha to a shaking, half-paralyzed wreck. He realized the awful, immediate truth. The moment Ava found rest, he found ruin. The pack elder, summoned by Rhett's strained, desperate command, arrived and immediately diagnosed the impossible affliction. "It is the fey curse of dual consciousness," the elder explained grimly, keeping a safe distance from the sleeping Ava. "If one mate sleeps, the other is overwhelmed by an immediate, crippling magical fatigue and paralysis. Your consciousness is chained. If one of you is unconscious, the other cannot function." Rhett pushed himself up against the wall, fighting the leaden weight in his limbs. "And if we both sleep, if both succumb, the curse stabilizes," the elder said, his voice dropping to a funereal whisper. "But you will enter the endless sleep, a permanent magical stasis from which neither of you will ever wake. You will be together, yes, but eternally separated from life itself." The clock was already ticking. Rhett had hours, maybe a day, of accumulated fatigue before his own body would betray him and pull him into the fatal darkness. The elder revealed the terrifying path to survival. The only known antidote is the Dream Weavers Elixir, but the recipe is hidden in the Sunstone Library, a place warded by cognitive mazes and puzzles designed to prey on the slightest mental weakness. Rhett looked at his mate, whose peaceful sleep was his active demise. He knew they couldn't risk waking her yet, as the fatigue would return the moment she closed her eyes again. With immense effort, Rhett forced his leaden body into motion. He grabbed a bucket of ice water and poured it directly over his head, the shock forcing a temporary surge of consciousness. "We move now," Rhett rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We stay awake, we find the sunstone, and we do not stop. Because if one of us falls, the other falls forever." Chapter 1. The first 24 hours were a waking nightmare. After rousing Ava with a painful shock of cold water, Rhett explained the lethal curse. The relief of being awake was immediately replaced by the harrowing realization that neither of them could ever relax again. They looked at their cozy pack chambers, now a trap, and decided to move to the road immediately. They began their journey toward the Sunstone Library, walking side by side, but utterly separated by the terrifying knowledge that the slightest lapse by one would cripple the other. Rhett's powerful alpha senses felt dull and slow, and Ava's normally sharp elemental focus was fractured by exhaustion. They were running on pure adrenaline and terror. When they were forced to stop at a rudimentary camp to rest their aching muscles, but not their minds, Rhett produced 2 lengths of thick, coarse rope. He secured one end of each rope to a sturdy, exposed tree root. "This is our anchor," Rhett rasped, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. "We tie the other end around our wrists taut. If either of us leans for comfort, the pull will deliver a jolt of pain that hopefully overrides the magical paralysis." The irony was agonizing. They were mates, meant to share burdens and comfort, but here they were, tying themselves to cold, inanimate wood and preparing to inflict pain on themselves just to survive. Ava stared at the rope, tears of exhaustion and frustration filling her eyes. This is what our love is now? Pain and perpetual vigilance? Rhett didn't answer with words. He took the rough rope and secured it tightly around his own wrist, the coarse fibers immediately digging into his skin. He then looked at Ava, his tired eyes conveying the absolute vow. I will endure this agony for you. Ava mirrored his action, the simple act of self-harm cementing their terrible new bond. They sat facing the darkness, separated by the 6-foot length of rope and the crushing need for sleep, struggling not against an external enemy, but against the primal sweetest temptation of rest. Every minute dragged, their mate bond, designed for synchronization, now only served to magnify their shared, crippling exhaustion. The ropes were crude anchors, but even pain couldn't fight the sheer magical weight of 48 hours of accrued exhaustion. They were walking a narrow, rocky trail when it happened. Rhett was talking, trying to keep Ava's mind engaged, detailing the history of the Sunstone Library. Ava's head was nodding slightly, her eyes blinking sluggishly, then a flicker. A micro-sleep lasting barely 2 seconds. The effect on Rhett was immediate and brutal. The world dissolved into a sickening swirl. The magical fatigue, momentarily unchecked, slammed into him like a physical blow, paralyzing his muscles and stealing his vision. His heart pounded a frantic, irregular rhythm. He stumbled hard, his alpha senses failing entirely. For those agonizing seconds, his powerful body was nothing more than a leaden, useless anchor. When Ava startled awake, the magical fatigue instantly lifted from Rhett, but the consequences of the lapse were already unfolding. Rhett, disoriented and fighting the terrifying residual paralysis, was battling a vivid hallucination. He saw a monstrous shadow creature lunging at Ava from the dense pine forest. He roared, channeling his power to attack the non-existent threat, nearly firing a powerful kinetic blast toward a perfectly harmless pile of fallen rock right beside the real, unstable cliff edge. "Rhett, no, it's not real!" Ava screamed, grabbing his arm and forcing his gaze toward the actual world. Her voice, sharp with panic, finally cleared the lingering shadows. He stood shaking, realizing his exhausted mind had nearly killed them both by acting on a phantom threat. His alpha focus, once absolute, was now their biggest liability. From a ridge above, a figure watched them with cold, calculating eyes. It was Selene, the powerful, ambitious beta from a neighboring territory, who had long desired to see Rhett's pack destabilized, and perhaps take his power for herself. She had trailed them, noticing their ragged exhaustion and unnatural behavior. Selene watched Rhett nearly blast a rock and saw the strange, desperate panic in Ava's eyes. She didn't know the curse, but she understood the weakness. Rhett, the untouchable alpha, was now tragically, physically flawed. A powerful alpha who couldn't trust his own eyes was an alpha waiting to fall. And Selene was patient. Chapter 2. The world, for Rhett and Ava, had become a shifting, unreliable canvas. After nearly 72 hours without true rest, the magical fatigue was no longer just a physical weight. It was a potent hallucinogen, actively warping their perception and driving a terrifying wedge of doubt between them. The forest path, already difficult to navigate, transformed into a relentless psychological torment. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered accusation, and the line between reality and the curse's insidious manipulation blurred entirely. For Rhett, the hallucinations preyed directly on his deepest fear, his failure as an alpha. He would catch fleeting, hyper-realistic glimpses of Selene, the rival beta, stepping out from behind trees. She wasn't threatening him with a weapon. She was simply watching him, her face a sneer of cold contempt, mouthing words he couldn't quite hear. Weak. You're failing her. He'd stop dead, his muscles locking in a futile, aggressive posture, only for Ava to gently rub his arm, reminding him, "Rhett, there's nothing there. It's just a rock." But the image was so vivid, the betrayal so real, that a corrosive thread of paranoia began to weave through his mind. Was Ava seeing the same thing, but lying to protect his ego? Ava's visions were crueler, exploiting her deepest longing for comfort. She would hallucinate a perfectly warm, soft bed, sometimes a luxurious one, sometimes just a simple pile of moss, right in the middle of the trail. The illusion was so comforting, so irresistibly inviting, that her feet would involuntarily drag, desperate to collapse into the imagined safety. Once, she reached out, tears welling as she felt the cool silk of a phantom blanket, only to realize she was reaching into a pile of sharp, wet thorns. Rhett had to physically stop her, his grip painfully tight, forcing her forward. "Keep walking, mate. It's not real. If you close your eyes, you go into the endless sleep, and I will be paralyzed." The constant need for verbal validation became their only anchor to reality. They walked in forced dialogue, a non-stop, exhausting stream of consciousness. "Ava, what color is that tree bark?" "Rhett, are my boots red or brown?" "Do you hear the water?" The moment one question went unanswered, or the answer seemed uncertain, the other mate was plunged into a spiral of doubt. The curse was manipulating their exhaustion to shatter the one thing they needed most: trust. The terrifying question lingered in the mind of the Alpha. Was his exhausted mate guiding him toward the Sunstone Library, or was she, unintentionally, guiding him toward a comfortable, irreversible death? They were fighting not just a magical curse but the breakdown of their shared sanity. The incessant need for verbal checks had worn Rhett and Ava raw. They were now functioning on an exhausted, aggressive autopilot, snapping answers at each other, their patience eroded by the lack of sleep. They stumbled into a dense thicket, their focus dangerously narrowed to the few feet of ground directly in front of them. It was precisely the moment Selene had planned for. She launched her ambush, not with a massive frontal assault, but with a calculated diversion. A sudden volley of small, non-lethal, magically enhanced shadow darts flew from the dense foliage, specifically designed to blur the peripheral vision and mimic the hallucinations Rhett had been fighting. Rhett immediately reacted, not to the real danger, but to the phantom fear. He saw the shadowy figures of Selene and her guards, but his mind instantly flagged them as another cruel trick of the fatigue. "Ignore it, Ava. It's the curse again. She's not real. Don't let the illusion stop us," he yelled, dismissing the very real threat as another figment of his exhausted imagination. He tried to power straight through the spot where the darts were landing, believing the ground was clear. Ava, however, felt a sharp, burning pain as a genuine shadow dart grazed her arm. The reality of the attack, coupled with the shock of her Alpha ignoring a real wound, snapped her out of her own fog. "Rhett, stop! It's not an illusion. I'm hit. They are real!" The sound of Ava's genuine distress finally pierced the fog of Rhett's paranoia. The shock of realizing his fatigue had betrayed his deepest protective instincts, making him dismiss his mate's immediate physical pain, was agonizing. He roared, shaking off the paralyzing fear of hallucination, and spun, finally seeing the very real, very smug Selene stepping out of the shadows with her two genuine guards. Selene smiled, savoring the moment. The Alpha can no longer trust his own eyes. "Your strength is useless when your mind is a sieve, Rhett." She ordered her guards to attack Ava, knowing that a direct threat to his mate would force the exhausted Alpha to make a mistake. Rhett lunged forward, his Alpha power raw and furious, driven by the terror of his delayed response. He had to fight against real enemies with real weapons while still battling the psychological terror that his own mate could disappear into a paralyzing microsleep at any second. The ambush had succeeded in forcing the Alpha to fight blind, desperate, and consumed by the ultimate agony of self-doubt. His mistake had put Ava, the one person he needed to stay awake, in immediate physical danger. Chapter 3. They had escaped Selene's ambush, leaving the wounded Beta raging behind them. but the fight had cost Rhett and Ava precious hours and driven their accumulated exhaustion to a perilous peak. They finally reached the ancient, crumbling entrance of the Sunstone Library. The very air here seemed heavy, thick with the weight of centuries and magical wards. The elder had been right. The entrance was not guarded by monsters, but by a challenge far crueler to their current state. Blocking the doorway was a massive stone floor inset with a grid of glowing, patterned tiles. This was the Maze of Doubt, a complex, timed logic puzzle. A central rune pulsed, and a sequence of 6 tiles lit up, defining a path. They had mere seconds to duplicate the sequence perfectly, or the entire maze would reset with a painful, blinding flash, forcing them to start over and costing them more vital minutes of wakefulness. The logic was simple, but the execution was hellish. After nearly 4 days without sleep, their short-term memory was failing, their reaction times were non-existent, and their double vision made distinguishing the glowing patterns nearly impossible. It was green, yellow, blue. Wait, no, the 4th one was definitely red. Ava cried out, trembling, her head snapping to the side as she fought off a brief bout of involuntary narcolepsy. Her gaze blurred, making the whole grid swim. Rhett, gripping the stone doorframe to keep his heavy body upright, was faring no better. His alpha focus, usually a laser, was now a scattered sieve. He saw 2 or 3 overlapping sequences, remnants of past attempts haunting the corners of his vision. When he finally forced his foot down on what he swore was the 2nd tile, the entire floor erupted in a dazzling, painful white flash, throwing them backward and sending a jolt of burning magic through their systems. "We missed it! The 4th tile!" Rhett groaned, slamming his fist against the cold stone, the frustration a bitter sting. "I knew it was red, but then I saw blue over it. I can't trust my own eyes, Ava." They repeated the painful cycle over and over. 10 attempts, 20. Each failure deepened the exhaustion, making the next attempt exponentially harder. The fatigue was deliberately creating misfires in their communication. One would see the pattern, but the lag in relaying the information meant the other was already stepping on the wrong tile. The curse was exploiting their cognitive failure to inflict the ultimate torment. The agonizing, repeated realization that they were too tired to be smart, and their weakness was the only thing preventing them from reaching the cure. They realized the maze wasn't testing their logic. It was testing their capacity for frustration management while fighting the sweet, fatal lure of sleep. After what felt like an eternity of failed attempts, and the agonizing realization that their exhaustion was a greater obstacle than any physical monster, Rhett and Ava finally, miraculously, completed the final sequence of the Maze of Doubt. The patterned floor tiles recessed with a deep, resonant thunk, and a small stone aperture opened, revealing a pedestal with the final obstacle. It wasn't a physical key, but a visual puzzle, a lens of polished obsidian reflecting a specific, complex fey glyph onto the far wall. To open the door to the inner library, they had to input the correct distorted key. The glyph is seen through the lens, but only the parts that didn't overlap with the original pattern. The task required pinpoint visual accuracy and absolute mental clarity. Ava gasped, raising a trembling hand to her eyes. The strain of the past 80 hours had taken its inevitable toll. She was suffering from severe, persistent double vision. The single, crucial glyph was dancing before her, 2 distinct, blurry images overlapping and shifting every time her eyes fought to focus. "Rhett, I can't. It's too much. I see 2 glyphs and they're moving. I can't tell which parts are meant to overlap." Rhett felt a fresh wave of despair, but beneath the crushing fatigue, his alpha instinct, the need to protect and lead, finally snapped into sharp focus. His sight was blurry, but Ava's double vision was predictable. The curse had weaponized their individual flaws, but they could use their shared truth to fight back. Wreathing through his dry throat, Rhett grabbed Ava's shoulder, forcing her to look at him. "The curse makes you see double, but your focus is usually sharper than mine. Tell me exactly where the 2 images intersect. Don't fight the blur, use it. The overlaps are the common points, the non-overlaps are the key. He then became her external memory, her logical anchor. He described the unchanging, stable physical shape of the true glyph on the lens, forcing his words to counteract the distortions in her mind. Focus, mate. Tell me the shape of the outer edges of the doubled image. Now, find the single distinct line that only appears in the bottom right corner of the left image, but not the right. Ava, tears of exhaustion streaming down her face, fought through the swirling colors and phantom lines, using her analytical mind to override her failing sight. It's a broken spiral, like a crescent, but one point is longer. Only the top crescent matches perfectly in both. Rhett translated her frantic, exhausted report into the final, correct sequence. With the last of his strength, he reached forward, his fingers shaking uncontrollably, and pressed the final sequence into the lock. The stone door to the inner Sunstone library ground open with a sound like distant thunder. They had succeeded, not by overcoming their exhaustion, but by trusting each other's failures. They stumbled over the threshold, leaning on each other for support, knowing the cure was close, but aware that every minute gained meant a higher price paid in lost consciousness. Chapter 4. The inner sanctum of the Sunstone Library was a relief, a stable, quiet haven away from the blurring chaos of the forest. The air hummed with dormant magic, and the soft, internal light was a welcome balm to their tortured eyes. Driven by the sheer, desperate need for rest, Rhett and Ava staggered toward the central plinth, which held a massive, scroll-like slate. Rhett, now barely able to hold a thought for more than a few seconds, used his alpha strength to steady Ava, who was fighting persistent tremors. Together, they forced their eyes to track the glowing script of the Dream Weavers Elixir recipe. It was a complex herbal formula, demanding precise measurements and rare components. But one ingredient stood out, etched in deep, alarming runes. "The core component," Ava whispered, tracing the phrase with a trembling finger, "is the essence of the vigil, the magical energy released when a mate willingly enters the eternal dream state for a full cycle." Rhett's blood ran cold, instantly shocking him into a moment of devastating clarity. The eternal dream, that's the Fey term for the fatal, permanent sleep. This recipe requires one of us to intentionally trigger the deepest, most paralyzing phase of the curse. The realization was a crushing blow. The recipe didn't cure the curse, it exploited it. To harvest the necessary essence, one mate had to ingest a preparatory herb that would force them into a complete, non-waking, magical paralysis for exactly 1 hour. During that hour, the paralyzed mate would release the potent energy needed to complete the elixir. And the cost? The other mate would be left completely alone, enduring the full, crippling force of the curse's magical fatigue and paralysis for 60 long minutes, totally unable to move or defend themselves, while simultaneously being the only functional defense for the vulnerable paralyzed mate. "If I take the herb, Rhett," Ava said, her voice barely a breath, "you'll be instantly paralyzed by the curse, just like when I fell asleep on the bed. You'd be defenseless, and you'd have to fight the complete crushing fatigue while I'm completely vulnerable." She looked at her alpha, whose eyes were heavy with 4 days of exhaustion. "If you take it, I have to face the paralysis, and you have to somehow find the strength to stay conscious and defend us both while fighting the worst fatigue you've ever felt." The elixir's price wasn't a rare flower. It was an hour of absolute, lethal vulnerability, protected only by a mate already on the brink of collapse. The argument was quiet, desperate, and fueled by the toxic cocktail of terror and sleep deprivation. They were arguing over who was the most expendable, the most likely to survive while watching the other die. Rhett immediately reached for the herb required for the paralysis. "I take it, Ava. I'm the alpha. My pain tolerance is higher, and my consciousness is anchored by the pack's survival instinct. You need to be the one who defends. You're faster and can channel power without having to physically move my leaden body." Ava slapped his hand away, her eyes blazing with fierce, exhausted defiance. Absolutely not, Rhett. You haven't slept in 4 days. When I took that microsleep, the residual fatigue made you hallucinate monsters and misinterpret a real ambush. When I fall into the full magical paralysis, the resulting fatigue will render you completely immobile. You'll collapse before the first minute is out, and I'll be left utterly defenseless to Selene when she inevitably finds us. Rhett pushed back, his voice low and ragged. And what about you? Your natural state is light sleep. The moment I'm paralyzed, you'll be the one fighting the crushing, inescapable paralysis while defending the cure. My strength is physical. Yours is cognitive. We're at the Sunstone Library, Ava. You used up the last of your clear thought solving the maze. Your mind is fractured. The truth of his words cut deep. Ava was fighting a constant, painful tremor. She knew she was moments away from hallucinating another soft, comforting bed and collapsing into the fatal rest. Yet her mate bond compelled her to argue for his safety. My mind may be fractured, but my instinct to protect you is stronger than your need to lead. I am the better choice because if you fail, the pack loses everything. If I fail, only the Luna is lost and the Alpha can eventually recover. There is no recovering if I wake up to find you paralyzed and murdered, Rhett roared, his voice cracking from strain. He scooped up the herb, his hand shaking uncontrollably, and looked at her, his alpha gaze burning with absolute command. I will not let you take this risk. My consciousness is the only thing strong enough to endure the full weight of the curse while still fighting. Endure this one, final command, mate. It is the only way we both survive. The argument wasn't about power or ego. It was about two mates, pushed past their breaking point, fighting over who had the right to suffer the most agonizing vigil to save the other. Chapter 5. The argument ended not with a shouted command, but with a sudden, devastating action. As Rhett moved to physically secure the herb to prevent Ava from taking it, Ava acted with the desperate cunning born of exhaustion. She knew Rhett's superior alpha speed would win any physical struggle, so she didn't fight him. She simply moved. In a lightning-fast motion that defied her 4 days of sleep deprivation, Ava snatched the crucial herb from the pedestal where they had placed it and swallowed the entire leaf before Rhett could even register the movement. Ava, no! Rhett roared, his final word cracking with disbelief and panic. The effect was instantaneous, total, and terrifying. Ava's eyes, already heavy with fatigue, immediately rolled back. Her body went completely rigid, then collapsed onto the stone floor with a heavy, final thud. She wasn't sleeping. She was utterly paralyzed, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling. The process of harvesting the essence of the vigil had begun. The magical fatigue that had been slowly crippling Rhett over the past 90 hours suddenly slammed into him with the raw, cumulative force of 100 missed nights of sleep. It was a suffocating, paralyzing weight. His muscles instantly failed. He fell to his knees, his vision blurring until the world was reduced to a nauseating kaleidoscope of gray and light. His jaw locked, and a sound of sheer, desperate agony tore from his throat. A choked, wounded noise that was not a roar, but the sound of an alpha's will breaking under impossible magic. He tried to crawl toward her, to check her pulse, to simply confirm she was still alive, but his body betrayed him. His arms felt like stone anchors, his legs were useless, and his mind was engulfed in a fog that threatened to pull him into the fatal, endless sleep within minutes. He was pinned, paralyzed, and suffering the most brutal, focused fatigue the Fey curse could inflict. Rhett pressed his face against the cold stone floor, focusing every remaining fragment of his alpha consciousness on one single, terrible thought. 60 minutes. You have 60 minutes to stay awake and alive. His mate lay vulnerable and unconscious feet away, and the powerful alpha was reduced to a shaking, immobile wreck, totally unable to protect her. The hour-long vigil had begun. The crushing magical fatigue was a suffocating shroud. Rhett lay immobile on the stone floor, his entire consciousness reduced to a frantic, silent scream. Every muscle fiber felt disconnected from his will. The sheer weight of his accumulated exhaustion, amplified by Ava's paralysis, threatened to pull him under into the fatal endless sleep. He could only move his eyes, watching the paralyzed, vulnerable form of his mate just feet away. Then, the final, inevitable hammer blow fell. Selene, having tracked their power signature, stepped into the Sunstone Library. She didn't bother with subterfuge. She walked directly toward the motionless mates, her face alight with cold triumph. "Pathetic," Selene sneered, kicking a shard of stone toward Rhett's face. The mighty Alpha, defeated by a simple sleep. Rhett's mind screamed warnings, threats, and commands, but only a small, ragged gasp escaped his throat. He tried to shift, to snarl, to summon even a fraction of his kinetic power, but the magical fatigue held him captive. He was a spectator at his own execution, forced to watch his rival approach his defenseless mate. Selene knelt by Ava's paralyzed body, examining the herb residue on her lips. "The vigil herb. How noble. You chose to sacrifice your rest to harvest the cure. But you forgot one thing, Luna. A defenseless body is merely an ingredient." She drew a dagger, a wicked silver blade designed to disrupt elemental energy, and raised it over Ava's heart. The sight of the blade aiming for Ava's chest was the final breaking point. It bypassed the magical fatigue and bypassed the paralysis. It ignited pure, feral alpha instinct. Rhett couldn't move his limbs, but he channeled the raw, desperate surge of his mate bond into the only parts of his body still capable of action, his vocal cords and his eyes. He didn't roar a command. He let loose a sound of absolute, primal territorial fury, a guttural, non-verbal alpha snarl so deafening and potent, it was less a sound and more a shock wave. Selene staggered back, dropping the dagger in shock. The sheer, terrifying will behind the sound, the raw essence of the alpha unbound by magic or physical state, was enough to temporarily paralyze her. In that fractional second of advantage, Rhett poured every last drop of his consciousness into forcing one paralyzed arm to lift. Slowly, agonizingly, his hand lifted from the floor, trembling violently, fueled only by the need to intercept the fallen dagger. He used the sheer force of his alpha command to grab the silver blade and, with the last vestige of strength, flung it with a desperate, weak arc toward the beta. The blade didn't strike Selene, but it struck the massive support column behind her. The clang of metal on stone was enough. Selene, terrified of the alpha's unexpected, impossible defiance, and fearing the paralysis would soon wear off, chose to flee rather than risk another confrontation. She vanished into the shadows, leaving Rhett breathing in ragged, painful gasps, his arm collapsing back onto the floor, his vision fading to black. He had won the battle, but he had hours of fatigue to pay back before his mate awoke. Chapter 6. The hour of magical paralysis ended with a searing jolt. Ava's eyes blinked, the focus instantly returning, and the crippling magical immobility was gone. Her breath hitched as she sat bolt upright, instantly aware of the overwhelming silence and the devastating cost of her sacrifice. The first thing she saw was the blood, a dark, sticky stain on the stone floor where Selene's silver dagger had been dropped, and faint smears leading back to the support column. The second thing she saw was Rhett. He lay sprawled on the floor beside her, not in the paralyzed state she had left him in, but in a terrible, deep, unconscious stupor. His powerful alpha body was lax and defeated, his skin pale and clammy, his jaw slack. The terrifying paralysis curse had lifted, but the sheer, crushing weight of accumulated 5-day-old fatigue had finally claimed him. He was breathing, but shallowly, raggedly. He was on the brink of the endless sleep. Ava scrambled to his side, her own body protesting from the sudden rush of energy. "Rhett, wake up! We have to move!" She slapped his cheek gently, then harder, but he didn't stir. His consciousness had simply abandoned the fight, no longer anchored by the magical paralysis. She realized he hadn't just endured the magical paralysis. He had been awake, battling the full, crushing force of it for the entire hour. The final, desperate effort to snarl and fling the dagger had drained the last of his willpower, leaving him vulnerable to the fatigue that now threatened to consume them both. Tears streamed down her face as she saw the physical toll. His eyes were bruised purple, his hands were scarred raw from the ropes and scraped bloody from the floor, and his alpha scent, usually sharp and dominant, was faint and metallic with exhaustion. He had saved her life, but in doing so, he had walked to the very precipice of death. "You fool," Ava whispered, running trembling fingers through his sweat-soaked hair. "You were supposed to survive to finish the elixir." She knew the rules. If she allowed him to fall into true, deep sleep now, the curse would drag her down with him into the permanent, eternal dream. The life she had just saved would be meaningless. The only thing keeping her awake now was the terror of his silence. She had to finish the elixir and deliver the final cure before her own exhaustion, which was only moments behind his, claimed them both. She was faced with the ultimate, agonizing race against the clock, carrying the weight of her collapsed alpha on her back. The sight of Rhett's collapsed form, a monumental silent sacrifice, reignited a primal, terrifying clarity in Ava. There was no room for grief or rest. The clock was ticking down to the endless sleep for both of them. She shoved the fear down and focused entirely on the Dream Weavers Elixir recipe. Her hands, trembling from 4 days of fatigue, moved with frantic, precise purpose. She used the immense energy released during her hour of paralysis, the essence of the vigil, and combined it with the remaining herbs they had gathered. She ignored the way her own vision was beginning to swim and the heavy magnetic pull of sleep that was mirroring Rhett's collapse. She ground the final ingredients and mixed the potent liquid in a small crystal flask. The resulting elixir was a thick, silver liquid, humming with active, restorative magic. She crawled back to Rhett, pulling his heavy, inert body upright so his head rested against her shoulder. His exhaustion was so profound that she could barely feel his breath. She gently tipped his chin up and placed the flask to his lips, but she stopped. The elixir wasn't meant to be forced. The elder's words echoed in her mind. The Fey cure required a shared, absolute faith. It had to be a simultaneous, conscious act. "Rhett," she whispered, shaking him gently, pouring every ounce of her remaining will into the mate bond. "Wake up. Just for a second, mate. We have to drink this together. Don't let my sacrifice be for nothing." For a horrifying minute, there was nothing. Then, Rhett's heavy eyelids fluttered open. His eyes were unfocused, glazed over with the fatal pull of sleep, but the raw alpha command deep in his core fought to surface. He gave her a slow, weak nod, a recognition that he was present, even if his body was failing. Ava held the flask between them, splitting the restorative liquid precisely into 2 unequal halves, a larger portion for the deeply afflicted Rhett. She placed her portion to her lips and guided Rhett's hand to hold his. "The elixir requires a final vow," Ava rasped, her own voice thick with approaching sleep. "We vow to always guard the other's rest. We vow that sleep is a gift, never a curse. Together, Rhett. Now." They raised the flasks. In that final, perfect moment of absolute shared consciousness, they drank the elixir. The magical liquid burned down their throats, and then a profound sense of release washed over them. The crippling paralysis and the crushing fatigue lifted instantly. The magical anchor of the curse was broken. The relief was so immense, so complete, that the instant the magic lifted, both mates collapsed instantly into a deep, drug-like slumber, falling together on the stone floor of the library. But this time, they were safe. They were free. The epilogue. The sleep was not a surrender. It was a sanctuary. When Rhett finally woke, it wasn't to the sickening weight of magical fatigue, but to the soft, gentle light of dawn filtering through the Sunstone Library's narrow windows. He was warm, resting against a pile of furs Ava had somehow managed to procure before her final collapse, and the scent of Ava was clean, calm, and nearby. He turned his head slowly, finding her asleep beside him, her face peaceful and utterly beautiful, devoid of the purple bruising and the frantic terror that had haunted her eyes for 5 days. Rhett reached out a hand, not to anchor himself in pain, but to offer comfort, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. He could rest, she could rest, and the world was right. The silence of the library was no longer a threat, but a profound, glorious peace. A week later, back at the pack house, life had been forever altered. The curse was broken, and the Dream Weavers Elixir had permanently anchored their consciousness, allowing them both the simple, luxurious gift of sleep. However, the experience etched a permanent mark on their mate bond and their leadership. The pack noticed it immediately. The Alpha and Luna were no longer just strong, they were vigilant. Rhett instituted a new, non-negotiable rule in the pack. No mate goes unwatched during sleep. He understood, more than anyone, the immense vulnerability of rest. Their intimacy was transformed. They found a profound new security in their shared vulnerability. Their large alpha bed, once a place of frustration during the first curse, was now their most sacred space. One night, Ava woke up, startled by the moonlight. She looked over and saw Rhett sitting upright beside her, not sleeping, but simply watching her. "What is it, love? Are you having trouble?" she whispered, immediately checking his eyes for signs of strain. Rhett shook his head, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. "No, I'm perfectly rested." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I just realized that I spent 5 days fighting the urge to fall asleep for fear of losing you. Now, I watch you sleep because it is the most beautiful thing in the world." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a kiss of deep, enduring peace. "Our bond is the ultimate anchor, Ava," Rhett murmured. "We know we can fight for days without rest, but we also know that our greatest strength is the simple, honest choice to guard the other's rest. We will never take a quiet moment for granted again." They settled back down, their bodies finally touching without the threat of magic. Two souls who had proven that the depth of their commitment was measured not by the chaos they endured, but by the peace they protected for each other.